Hume, Bergson, Nietzsche, and Spinoza are widely recognized as foundational influences on Deleuze. They shaped his philosophy in profound ways. By the late 1960s, Deleuze had already engaged decisively with each of them in some of his most famous works. It seemed then that Deleuze's key influences were already in place. However, there is one striking exception, a thinker he only turned to much later in the late 1980s, during his so-called Third Period. This thinker certainly was to the late Deleuze what the others had been to the early Deleuze. Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz. Leibniz became so central to Deleuze at the time that he made him the subject of his final philosophical portrait, The Fold. Deleuze's third period is often associated with his research on the foundational question, what is philosophy, which led to his ultimate book of the same name, co-written with Guattari. We know from the seminars that this project had long been in the works for Deleuze, at least since the early to mid-1980s. He even thought about making it the subject of his last seminar, which he gave in 1987, but he did not feel ready at the time, and quite remarkably he decided to make it about Leibniz instead, even against the will of some of his students. Why did Leibniz suddenly become so fascinating to Deleuze? How can a rationalist and systematic thinker of the 17th century contribute to what a modern philosopher has to say about philosophy? And then not just that, but it's not the content of Leibniz's thought that Deleuze was interested in, for as he says, the Baroque, to which Leibniz's thought is central, represents the ultimate attempt to reconstitute classical reason. This is not exactly Deleuze's concern, so why would he bother studying it in the first place? How does it relate to what philosophy is? Well, the answer could be that Deleuze was less interested in what Leibniz said than in what he did. As we will see, Leibniz was trying to fight the rise of philosophies like empiricism that went so far as to doubt the absolute primacy of reasonable principles over nature. But in so doing, he found himself engaged in an extremely perilous situation, as he was forced to find new powers in very ancient views that were seemingly exhausted. Even though Leibniz did not manage to contain empiricism, his influence on Kant and German Romanticism and even on modern thought is quite decisive. So in this video we're going to examine how Deleuze describes Leibniz's exceptional story and show why Leibniz became, for the later Deleuze, truly one of the goats of philosophy. Leibniz was not just a philosopher, he was also one of the inventors of calculus, and his ideas on infinitesimals, curves, and continuity are fundamental for his theory of monads. While calculus can feel intimidating, today's sponsor, Brilliant, helps you understand it with its unique visual and interactive method. With its special course on calculus, Brilliant makes learning intuitive and engaging, helping you build a real understanding of concepts through actively solving problems. Instead of just memorizing abstract formulas, you'll develop a feel for how calculus works, in a way that would certainly make Leibniz proud. Plus, their approach is designed to maximize efficiency and fun, so you can make progress in just a few minutes a day, directly from your phone, wherever you are. This habit building is key to increase not just your understanding of calculus, but of math and logic in general. This is certainly useful to understand Leibniz, but equally to understand Deleuze. If you want to grasp the profound insights that Leibniz developed throughout his mathematical and philosophical career, you can start learning for free for a full 30 days at brilliant.org/DeleuzePhilosophy. And if you decide to continue, you'll get 20% off an annual premium subscription. Thank you to Brilliant for sponsoring this video. Leibniz was born in 1646 in Leipzig in the Holy Roman Empire and lived until 1716. His life trajectory was quite extraordinary. At 14, he entered university to study law, at 16 he earned his bachelor's degree in philosophy, and by 20 he had received his doctorate in law. Throughout his life, he pursued multiple careers as a jurist, a physicist, a politician, and a mathematician, though philosophy is what his name remains primarily associated with. And that is certainly because it is the domain which saw the highest exercise of his genius. But as it turns out, this exercise was not theoretical and abstract, as most people think. It was more like a knife fight with the enemies of systematic knowledge. We could summarize the situation as follows. Philosophy in the 17th century generally relied on a foundational principle, the principle of identity, which states that A equals A. meaning that a thing is what it is. This principle guarantees that perception aligns with thought, that the presentation of a thing to the senses corresponds to its image in the mind, due precisely to the transfer of identity, its essence or intelligible nature, from the external world into the intellect. However, this harmony, Deleuze says complicity, between the physical and mental realms began to unravel when certain thinkers began to suggest that our access to reality may not depend on rational principles. Empiricists like Locke or Hume argued that knowledge is primarily a function of sensory impressions, and Leibniz may have felt what was looming as the consequence of such a view, namely that we cannot know reality itself, only our impression of it. So his main concern became to reactivate the principle of identity in order to maintain the rights of reason over the material world and over subjective impressions. From a logical perspective, the principle of identity states that a proposition is necessarily true if it predicates, of an essence, one of its properties. So for example, when we say the triangle has three sides, this is necessarily true because triangle literally means having three sides. Similarly, saying all bachelors are unmarried is necessarily true because being unmarried is part of the concept of bachelor. So the principle of identity works perfectly well for what philosophers called analytic truths, statements that are true because the subject comprehends the predicate. But if we think about it, this is limited to a very narrow set of propositions. This is perhaps what triggered the empiricists so much. They were asking essentially, what about the rest of reality? For example, what about contingent propositions, whose truth require empirical verification? What about relative propositions that can change over time? Or even, what about future contingents that cannot be known in advance? These propositions cannot be covered by the principle of identity because they imply a lived component that is not grounded in anything else than itself. The act by which I verify that the cat is on the mat does not depend on a principle. In technical terms, it's unconditional. And indeed, philosophers later found that A equals A is in fact a conditional principle. What it really states is, if there is A, then A equals A. So philosophers like Leibniz had to find a principle that was unconditional and could cover all of reality, including those lived components. This was essentially the task of the rationalists. When Descartes formulated the cogito, it was a revolution because it was the first time that an unconditional principle was ever discovered. Descartes' reasoning is that I may well doubt absolutely everything, every identity, every existence, including my own, but if I do so, I cannot doubt that I doubt. And since doubting is thinking, the very act of me thinking guarantees that I exist. I think, therefore I am. In so doing, Descartes had formulated a principle that later thinkers reformulated as the autoposition of the self, by which subjectivity guarantees the existence of the objective world. The problem, however, is that the cogito only demonstrates the unconditional existence of the thinking subject in the immediate present, here and now, and so it leaves the rest of time uncovered. For Leibniz, it is all of reality, every single thing, including contingent and relative propositions, and even future contingents, that must be justified. Otherwise, nothing makes sense. His solution came in the form of a principle called the principle of sufficient reason, which Deleuze lyrically presents as a philosophical cry, a vital need much more than an abstract entity. Everything has a reason. This vulgar formulation already suffices to suggest the exclamatory character of the principle of sufficient reason, the identity of the principle and of the cry of reason par excellence. Deleuze calls this formulation vulgar because it hides the fact that Leibniz was not engaged in an abstract exercise. Much the contrary, he was dancing on the edge of a cliff, so to speak. Either he was going to show that this principle could be both unconditional and cover all of reality, or classical reason would fail, and perhaps all of philosophy with it. All of rational knowledge would plunge into madness. So how did Leibniz define the principle of sufficient reason? How did he extend it to all of reality? This is the topic of our next section.
Black shot.
Leibniz recognized that when fully developed, the principle of identity means all analytic judgments are true. The properties of a thing can truthfully be predicated of that thing, so to that extent the ancients were correct, and the principle remains undeniable. But if this principle is to be maintained, it must cover contingent proposition, as we have seen. In other words, analysis must become the model of all knowledge, not just this small set of propositions. All types of propositions must conform somehow to the analytical model. What does this mean concretely? To use one of Leibniz's favorite examples, a proposition like Caesar crossed the Rubicon must be analytic or analyzable. But the problem is that crossing the Rubicon is a lived experience, you could say. It does not seem to be part of a greater concept, which is exactly why it's not covered by the principle of identity. But due to the requirements of analysis, it must somehow be part of a greater concept, in the same way that having three sides is part of the greater concept of triangle. Here is where Leibniz's stroke of genius came. He saw that it's possible to actually reverse the principle of identity. If A equals A means that all analytic judgments are true, then the reciprocal statement must be true as well. All true judgments are analytic. In Deleuze's terms, Leibniz recognized that the principle of identity is vectorized, and he simply reversed the direction of the vector, by which he maintained the equality while reciprocating the identity. What does this mean that all judgments are analytic? Well, in the case of the contingent proposition Caesar crossed the Rubicon, this means that the condition for it to be true is not external verification. Rather, it means that crossing the Rubicon must be included in a concept that is Caesar's. This concept is not Caesar as he existed, but rather as he can be thought. In other words, Leibniz is trying to subjugate existent things to analytical concepts, and it is in this sense that sufficient reason does not simply mean everything has a reason, but rather, as Deleuze says, sufficient reason is inclusion. In other words, the identity of the event and the predicate. Sufficient reason proclaims everything has a concept. Its metaphysical formulation goes as follows: all predication is grounded in the nature of things. As a logical formulation, every predicate is in the subject or nature of things being the notion, the concept of the thing. So the notion that all true judgments must be analytic means that somehow a subject contains all the possible predicates that can be made about it. It is at this price that everything, even every single event, can have a concept. It can be arrived at by a process of analysis of the subject. But this move, as brilliant as it is, leads to a lot of problems. For example, how does Leibniz account for the difference between eternal truths like 2 plus 2 equals 4 and contingent truths like Caesar crosses the Rubicon? As Deleuze explains, the difference resides in the type of analysis that is involved. Leibniz seems to be saying that in the case of necessary propositions or truths of essence, 2 plus 2 equals 4, the predicate is expressly included in the notion, while for contingent existences, like Adam sins or Caesar crosses the Rubicon, inclusion is only implicit or virtual. Must we be led to understand, as Leibniz sometimes suggests, that analysis is finite in one case and indefinite in the other? And the short answer is yes, eternal truths require a finite analysis to be demonstrated, while contingent truths require an indefinite analysis, that is, an analysis whose end we cannot anticipate. So Leibniz will have to find a way to show how an infinite process can in fact produce a finite quantifiable result. Perhaps you can see why he developed calculus, which allows us to do precisely this in mathematics, the summation of an infinite or indefinite series into a finite term. In order to answer this question, Leibniz develops, according to Deleuze, a formidable theory of the subject, which will be the topic of our next section. The first problem with Leibniz's model is this. Crossing the Rubicon may be part of the concept of Caesar, but then doesn't Caesar's concept also need to contain all the grains of sand that form the Rubicon and all the people that were with him? In other words, what does the concept of Caesar not contain? As it turns out, Leibniz is now forced to a rather extreme conclusion. If the concept of Caesar contains just one predicate, then by the law of cause and effect, it must contain the entire universe, the whole past and the whole future, the entire cosmos. Of course, the existing Caesar is not consciously aware of all these things, but the question remains, how is it possible for his concept, and by extension ours, to contain the whole universe while only being aware of a small fraction of it? And if all of us contain the whole universe, then how do we differentiate from each other? As Deleuze explains, this is the essential motivation for the concept of monad. As an individual unit, each monad conveys the entire world, but does not express it without expressing more clearly a small region of the world, a subdivision, a borough of the city, a finite sequence. Two souls do not have the same order, but neither do they have the same sequence or the same clear or enlightened region. This means that while each monad, each individual concept, contains the whole world, it only expresses a very small portion of it. What is this portion? In a word, it is its own perspective. It is the great introduction in philosophy of a theory of perspectivism, one that Nietzsche would later develop further. The rest of the universe will remain completely obscure, unconscious to the monad who contains it. But this same monad will have a small region of clarity which constitutes its individual view on the world. Not only does Leibniz invent perspectivism, but he also creates the concept of unconscious as the obscure part of the soul. Needless to say, this conception was extremely influential to modern thinkers. Leibniz defines clarity as a kind of harmony. How does clarity emerge? Or in other words, how does consciousness emerge? Deleuze says, in its own portion of the world, or in its clear zone, each monad thus presents accords, inasmuch as an accord can be called the relation of a state with its differentials, that is, with the differential relations among infinitely small units that are integrated into this state. So the unconscious is composed of differential and infinitely small units. These units are, to put it simply, the infinite chain of causes and effects that compose the universe. Consciousness appears when fractions or elements of this series are integrated, that is, selected and assembled or related with each other, around a particular point which is precisely the perspective that perceives them. For example, while the sound of a wave is the sum of a virtually infinite number of small drops of water, we can perceive its overall effect by integrating these small perceptions into a global experience that constitutes our perspective on the wave. This process of integration transforms, as in calculus, an infinite series of small perceptions into a representation, a particular and individual perspective. But now a third difficulty arises. Why is it that certain perspectives are expressed and others are not? There is an infinite number of small perceptions, since the obscure part of the soul has an infinite depth. So why are not all perspectives expressed? This is where Leibniz's argument becomes more distinctly theological. Leibniz believes that while all perspectives are possible, not all are compossible with our world. This concept of compossibility becomes essential to reconcile the finite and the infinite, and the passage from one to the other. Compossible essentially means coherent, and Leibniz being a pious man, his favorite example is to conceive of a world in which Adam had not sinned. Such a world is indeed possible in itself, because all things are possible, but it is incompossible with our world. Why is that? The difficulty here is that if God decides in advance which perspectives are actualized and which are not, then essentially there is no free will, and Adam did not sin out of his own volition, but because of God's choice, which means that God has incurred sin. That is, of course, unacceptable for Leibniz. Yet God must intervene somehow, since he is the creator of the world. Leibniz's answer in essence is this: God did not force Adam to sin, but he created the world in which Adam sinned, over the one where he did not. God did not do the act of sin, but he provided the circumstances, if you will. Does this mean that God is somehow ill-intentioned? Does this mean that he, in fact, causes evil? Well, God is not the cause of evil, since he only creates the world in which free choice, which incurs evil, can occur. But rather he always chooses the best of possible worlds, that is, the world where a maximal amount of perspectives are possible, or rather, as Deleuze says, God chooses between an infinity of possible worlds, incompossible with each other, and chooses the best, or the one that has the most possible reality. The fact that we do not live in a perfect world is precisely due to the fact that our perspective is finite. It requires that some things cannot exist, such as a world in which Adam hasn't sinned, otherwise we would not have free will. The criteria of the best intervenes here to maintain God's infinite and loving nature. In other words, when the infinite and the finite meet, the criteria is not the absolute good, but the best. In this way, Leibniz reconciles individual freedom with God's infinite power, and preserves the individuality of each soul, their free will, while maintaining their interconnectedness through the unconscious realm of small perceptions. The Baroque movement is fascinating because it has one foot in the past and one in the future. On the one hand, Leibniz tries to save classical reason against skeptical thoughts, but on the other hand, he creates the most bizarre philosophy ever seen, one that borders with science fiction. For example, Deleuze says, Leibniz is endlessly drawing up linear and numerical tables. With them, he decorated the inner walls of the monad. Perhaps there's an argument to be made that our computer screens, with which we populate our inner cognitive world, are really turning us into Leibnizian monads, maintaining a very small zone of clarity in an ocean of information. But at the beginning of this video, our question was, why is Deleuze so fascinated by Leibniz? We have seen Leibniz's incredible creativity, his determination to follow his original intuition to the very end. So that certainly may be a factor. But more profoundly, I think that Deleuze saw in rationalism, in particular in its most brilliant representative, an enterprise that is not fundamentally different from empiricism. Perhaps he saw that empiricism and rationalism are two sides of the same coin, two aspects of thought that cannot go without each other. Perhaps this is why at the beginning of The Fold he says, it could be argued that this text does not express Leibniz's thought, but instead the maximum degree of its possible conciliation with Locke. Leibniz was trying to find an eternal and unmoving principle to justify rational thought, but in so doing he engaged in the most impressive metaphysical creation, jumping to the other side of thought, which according to Deleuze is exactly what it means to do philosophy. Well, I hope this video was helpful to you to grasp a little bit of Leibniz's fundamental concepts. If so, please like and subscribe. That would be much appreciated. I'd also like to address a special thank you to my wonderful patrons, whose contribution I'm really thankful for. Thank you for making all of this possible. For now, thank you all for watching, and see you soon.